All right, well, good evening, everybody, or good morning if you're joining us from America or any other part of the world, I suppose. Welcome to another one of the American Library in Paris's virtual evenings with an author. I am Catherine Olien, Programs Manager at the library. For those of you who don't know the American Library in Paris, we are the largest English language lending library on the continent. We've got books, periodicals, and programs for all ages. And something really exciting about this year is that it's our centennial. So we're celebrating 100 years of the library in confinement, unfortunately. But we've found a way to gather virtually, and it's been really, really lovely to see some of you continue to join in every week and stay patient with our strange circumstances right now. If you're interested in learning more about our events, we've got a Facebook page where we're regularly posting about them. You can also check out our homepage, which lists all of the upcoming events, and subscribe to our e-newsletter, which comes out sort of bi-weekly. It's more on the weekly basis right now in confinement because we've got so many updates to give you, but you'll find more information about events like this one, virtual evenings with an author, and also workshops. And the evenings with an author are free and open to everybody, and our workshops are reserved for members. You can find out more about membership also directly on our website. In short, we hope that we can continue to bring you enrichment and comfort in the confinement period. I know that some of us are deconfined or some of the measures are being relaxed, but we sort of prefer to stay here, stay safe, and stay virtual for the time being. So thank you for your patience with that. And we are looking forward to seeing you in person as soon as we get the go ahead. So joining me this evening is Anissa Bouziane. She has already spoken at the library. Some of you may have been lucky enough to join us back in September of 2019 when Anissa gave us a wonderful musical reading and presentation at the library. So to tell you a bit about her, she was born in Tennessee to a Moroccan father and a French mother. She grew up in Morocco and then returned to the United States to attend Wellesley. So sorry about that slip. And later she earned her MFA from Columbia. She also has a film certificate from NYU. Right now she's working and living in Paris. She's teaching and she's completing her PhD in creative writing from the University of Warwick. Dune Song, which we'll be speaking about tonight, is her debut novel, and it explores issues of identity, faith, womanhood, displacement, courage, and a quest for knowledge, I would say, both self-knowledge and knowledge of the world. So thank you so much for joining us tonight, Anissa. We'll give you a little round of applause, a very quiet one.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. And even though I love the space at the American Library, I must admit that this occasion allows so many of my friends from the other side of the Atlantic to join us. And so I am absolutely thrilled. I wouldn't want it any other way. So,
yeah, we always have to pick a, sorry, go ahead.
Maybe at some point when we do go back into the space at the American Library, we can find a way to bring people from other horizons along in with us.
Exactly. I'm really glad you're mentioning that. I always try to find a silver lining, at least one a day in this strange period. So that's definitely a good silver lining because I took a little survey of who's joining us tonight, and it looks like there are a lot of people from France, some in Europe more generally, and then we do have quite a few from the US, and I assume those are friends and colleagues of yours. So that's fantastic.
Including someone from across the channel. So hello to all.
Hello to all. So we'll just begin sort of informally, ease into this. I just wanted to begin by asking you, how are you and where are you?
Okay, so I'm well, thank you for asking. I'm well, let's say the French, well, the Congolese, Francophone Congolese would say, je vais bien malgré. My sister taught me that. She lived many years in Kinshasa. And so malgré is despite. So I'm well despite a host of things I'm not going to talk about, but I'm well despite because it could be far worse. But I am confined in Paris in a small apartment where there is a beautiful French window, but across from which there is nothing but Paris's ugliest office building. So I don't have that marvelous skyline of Paris and the rooftops of Paris, which I would love to see, but no, instead I have something that I can't even describe, me who usually describes everything. So voila. I have not left frequently because I'm very serious asthmatic, so the world outside is frightening to me. But in consequence, one of the interesting things is this is a space that's inhabited by generations of women in my mother's family. My great-grandmother moved into this tiny space in 1908. And so I have been in communion with my ancestors on my matrilineal side, which is fantastic because it's at the heart of my second novel. So voilà, à quelque chose malheur est bon.
Wonderful. Thank you for giving us that update. I wondered also if you had any new hobbies that you've been getting into in these past months, now that you've had so much time sort of to yourself and
So rather than new hobbies, I have rediscovered old hobbies. I love to cook, but I'm always running around at 110 miles an hour. And so I don't cook as much as I would like to. But lately, it's not like I got too many places to go to. So I have been cooking. And again, really interesting, in the same tiny kitchen where my great-grandmother cooked, my grandmother cooked, my mother cooked. So this is, again, at the heart of the next novel. And oddly enough, I used to be very much into yoga when I lived in DC, and I have gotten back into yoga. So I have a daily yoga practice, which is not a bad thing. After all, I have to somehow or another transcend the four walls of my apartment, and yoga has allowed me to do that. So voila, those are my positives on the side of what have you been doing with your confinement.
Absolutely. Well, it sounds like you've been making the most of the time. Have you been writing at all, I have to ask?
So the answer is yes, malgré, despite. So yes, I have filled up an entire notebook of notes. It's my confinement notebook, but and I've even been drawing my novel, which is strange, but I'm
and everything by hand. That's interesting.
Yeah, conceptual person. So I've been drawing a lot. Dune Song was also something I drew at one point when I was particularly blocked. But I had 6 chapters of my first novel already written, and so I've thrown all of it out, and I've begun with a new version, but I haven't moved as fast as I would have wanted to because, you know, the time in confinement is strange.
It's very strange. Yeah.
Voilà.
We have to be kind to ourselves and sort of lower expectations, I think. Even as we're being let out slowly, there are a lot of questions lingering of what should I really be doing? Mostly I should still stay confined. So I'm really glad you've got a nice yoga practice and some writing to get you through the rest of that. Well, let's move on to the book then. Let's start talking about Dune Song. The reason that everybody is here, we're at 47 now, 47 screens. That's just fantastic. So I had a chance to read the book, I think it was last summer, right before we met and planned the event for last fall. But not everyone has read the book yet. So I hoped that you might give us a summary of Dune Song, maybe introduce us to some of the main characters, tell us a little bit about the arc of the plot, and maybe some of the settings and challenges that the characters face.
Okay, that's a lot. I could go on for 2 hours. So Dune Song. For those who have read it, there are a variety of different versions, the British version, the American version, and a French version entitled Sable, and an original Moroccan version that in my pile of books I can't seem to find, but I will. So in a nutshell, Dune Song is the story of a protagonist named Jihan Nafar, who is very similar to me, and we can talk about how she is similar and different to me later on, who, seeing the towers fall on September 11th, as I did, loses her handle on her American dream. And in her quest for meaning in this post 9/11 world, where she finds herself confronted with death on a scale that she thought unimaginable in America at the time. She returns to Morocco, but because that return is a reverse migration, the kind of stigma associated with that return makes that she doesn't have the courage to go home to her family, and instead goes into a deep dive into the Moroccan desert, and that becomes her quest for meaning. And ultimately, she finds that meaning in the most unlikely of fashions, because her path crosses that of individuals who are deeply embroiled in the tragedy of human trafficking across the Sahara from south to north. And so the novel becomes in many ways a cartography of the space between East and West in our post 9/11 world, and is an attempt to maybe speak about how can we chart a path forward in the 21st century with 9/11 as the smoldering backdrop of our era, and the issue of migration as one that asks us deep questions about our common humanity. Does that work?
Fantastic, thank you. That's a fabulous summary, and it gives us so much meat, I think, so much to imagine. And those of you who haven't read the book yet, I hope that you're interested now. So let's go back to what inspired you to originally begin this book. So you hinted at the fact that you were in New York as the towers fell, and as I've mentioned, and you've mentioned also, you grew up with links both to the United States and to Morocco. So I imagine some of this came from direct experience, but tell me again, basically, how was it to begin this book, and where was the inspiration?
Okay, inevitably, the inciting incident of the book is the collapse of the World Trade Center on September 11th. Personally, I would not have used that tragic event as the inciting incident of my book had I not been an eyewitness to that horror. So in some ways, the writing of the book was prompted by my attempt to come to terms with that trauma. And the issue of trauma and memory and fiction writing and memoir is key to me. It's even at the heart of what I'm doing for my second novel and for my doctorate at the University of Warwick. But going back to Dune Song, a lot of what I give Jehan Nathar, my protagonist, as a life experience in New York, in the moment from the time the towers fall to about 8 months later when she leaves New York, is inspired by my lived experience. And originally, that was the kernel of where the novel came from. I had been invited to Morocco to a university, an English language university in the Atlas Mountains called El Hawain University in March of 2002. And there was a conference there on how to conceive of a dialogue between East and West in the world after 9/11. And for those who've read my novel, the talk I gave at that conference was what would become the chapter inside the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, which was something that I lived and that I shared with my sister Yasmina, who has become a fictionalized character in the novel. People who have read it will recognize that Yazzie is Rizzy. And Yazzie and I were in the Cathedral of St. John the Divine during a service that was extremely moving because the cathedral had invited an imam to recite the Quran at the end of the service. And so for me, this became something of a moment of, rather than seeing 9/11 as a moment of breaking, of seeing it as a moment of opportunity for us to come together around our common humanity and our common quest for meaning and our sense of self and place on this planet. And when I gave that talk in Morocco, the academics and the artists present were in tears and said, "This is amazing, you have to write a book about it." And I started, but then I took too long, and then the Iraq War came on, and well, the Afghan War, the Iraq War, and I don't want to go back into the history of the immediate 20 years after that. But I suddenly thought, oh no, no one's going to want to read a book about this. But that's when I realized that it had to be more than about just my experience. And that I had to graft onto Jihan's experience something that might be more universal and that might be about the issues that are central now to our 21st century. And therefore, I had her go back to Morocco, go to the desert, and I had her life intertwined with those who are questing for a better tomorrow, searching for a horizon of hope. And for me, freedom is the capacity to imagine a better tomorrow, and the risks that those who take their lives in their hands to try and traverse the Sahara and then the Straits and beyond. I thought it was important, if the book was going to mean something more than Anissa dealing with her trauma as an Arab American of Muslim origin in the United States in the immediate aftermath of 9/11.
Absolutely. Wow, that was a robust answer. Thank you for that. So what I'm hearing is that, I mean, approaching the novel and writing it, both of those things seem to have been a cathartic experience for you, but that you were also searching for a way to open up the promise, as you say, of a better tomorrow and some of the other plot points. So it seems like there was a real balance between kind of self-healing and this hope that you could, you know, bring or write out elements that would heal the world or heal this divide between East and West. So how did you go about striking that balance? I mean, was it with these sort of two narratives? One felt like it was for yourself and one felt like it was for more of a, you know, somebody who's reading the book looking also for that healing, but isn't you, as you say? Or how did you strike that balance?
Okay, it can be read that way. No question about it. But I think one has to go back more to the impetus behind why I bothered to write in the first place. For me, the act of writing is an act of meaning making. And I know that a few of my students are in the audience today. I teach writing, and I teach creative writing and narrative writing and memoir writing. And the act of teaching is an act of inspiring young writers to try and use the pen to make sense of their lived experience, and in the process make sense of the world around them, and hopefully share that. So that, if I teach it that way, it's because that's how it works for me. So then, as I never saw the narratives as two, like Jihan is my life and Jihan in New York is my life, and Jihan in the desert is a fictional character meant to bring the reader in. They are two facets of me. They are opposite sides of an integrated whole. And that's what I'm looking for, is to say that the world where East meets West is not there is an East and there is a West and we're going to try to make them meet, is that we all live them simultaneously. And I certainly have been taught that if I'm going to make sense in terms of who I am, I have to find some kind of harmony in what others might see as dissonance. So part of it is that I've always been working with fragmented narratives, because I've got a fragmented, what can be perceived as a fragmented sense of self. But if I live it as a fragmented sense of self, then I don't make sense to me. So how do I create something unified out of that fragmentation is the very experience of being Anissa. And I assume a lot of us who are multicultural in various and different ways. So how do we then create a narrative that gives the experience of finding a whole in what might seem I won't say cacophonous, but polyphonous. Which brings me to one of the things that I do in my novel, which is I write in English. My imagination constructs itself in English. So if the baseline is English, I still want to give you the illusion of hearing Arabic, and I want to give you the illusion of hearing French. And so I play with that, and I create what I have termed linguistic polyphony. Which, Catherine, is this a good time for me to read?
Yeah, would you like to go ahead and read a short passage or two? That sounds great.
Okay, so as you can tell, this is very annotated copy, including what has just popped out of my book. Oh, goodness me, a crown. God knows where that came from. Okay, so voila, here's my crown. Let me read. No, I'm being a little silly.
I refuse to believe that wasn't scripted. That was just too fantastic.
I didn't do that on purpose, I swear. Who gave me this crown when I was doing the reading? Somebody gave it to me, but I did not prepare that. I promise I didn't. And but it worked pretty well, unless you thought it was obvious. Okay, so let me read. So I've also very much stylistically always been interested in the line between prose and poetry. So the prologue is very much something that rides that line. I'm also fascinated with music. And for those of you who were with us at the first reading at the American Library, you know that my fascination extended to bringing a musician to accompanying me as I read. So here, I'm just going to read the very beginning of the prologue, the first two paragraphs, and then I'm going to read a paragraph from the very next chapter, which is set in New York. So you hear these two voices that I'm talking about. I came to the Sahara to be buried, to let the rough hands of women I did not know, with their black jalabas flapping in the desert wind, guide me naked across the burning sands of Alia, the highest dune in the Moroccan desert, to let them ease me into the shallow pit they had dug for me only moments earlier. I came to the desert to feel the heat from every grain of sand press against the soles of my feet, my spine, my shoulder blades, my arms and neck, every inch of me scorched by the refracted fire of the sun. My exodus from New York was never meant to lead me to this burial ceremony atop the stateliest of the Moroccan dunes. Yet, at long last, for the first time since the towers fell, all seemed clear to me, as the women began to throw shovelful after shovelful of hot sand over my body, and I sensed every grain like so many tiny branding irons against my skin. Grain after grain, my body was covered, and every time a woman heaved sand up and onto me, she called out in Arabic, "This girl comes from the ends of the earth." And the others sang back, "Qabliha ya Alia," accept her, O saintly Alia. So that's the beginning of the prologue. What's interesting is that the fragmentation of my novel is such that the chapters are actually not very long. They go from being 1 to 2 pages to being maybe 8, 10 pages at most. So the very next chapter is set in New York, and they're titled New York, Morocco, New York, Morocco. As time passed, the image that came back to me most frequently that second Tuesday in September was a newspaper bearing a headline from the New York Post, "Michael Jordan, get a life."
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Oh, that's fantastic. I mean, I have goosebumps still from that first reading. I mean, I'll never forget opening the book and reading that first passage. And I was just thinking, yes, we have to get her to the library. I know that this is somebody who's got a lot of soul, a lot of passion, and a great deal of talent, of course, as well. So I wanted to turn to the question of, we've already touched a little bit on how much of the book is inspired by your direct experience and how much might be sort of invented. And you've also called this a work of autofiction. I wanted to explore what that meant to you as a label in practice.
Okay, so autofiction is one of these labels that lots of people define however they want. And so it goes from being very general of being a type of autobiography where fictionalized issues are infused deeply, or just certain elements are fictionalized, to being something much more in the Truman Capote line of the protagonist of the autofiction is the author. Okay, so in my case, Jihan is inspired by elements of me, but I am not Jihan. That being said, some of the early versions of the book, and it was written and rewritten for at least 10 years, some of the early versions of the book, Jihan, I mean, I think I actually had her name as Anissa rather than Jihan. So I would be lying if I were to say that it hadn't been deeply rooted in autobiography. But I profoundly believe that, well, okay, I'm one of these writers who rides the line between reality and fiction very closely. One might say Hemingway was similar, but we also know Hemingway did a lot of inventing. So I invent a lot for the simple reason that I actually fundamentally believe in the power of fiction to allow us a transcendent experience where if you read the book, yes, you'll find out a lot about me, about the way I make a sense of myself and in the process make sense of the world around me. And hopefully that'll allow you some kind of similar experience. But I also believe fiction has the capacity to do that in a way that is exponentially stronger than memoir. So I use the fictional elements because I know where the book was when I didn't take Jihan deep into the desert, when she didn't encounter the migrants and those who were smuggling migrants. Before that, it was what the French like to call de la littérature nombriliste, which is basically about my own belly button kind of thing. Okay, yeah. So what? And I is my passion for the power of fiction is such that it had to. I guess I write what I know, but then I go far beyond what I know to what I believe, and to what at one point Jihan told me. Because one of the interesting things is that it took me forever to write this book. And there were moments where I did not know where it was going. And I had to let go and have Jihan lead me. And that doesn't mean that I don't know the Moroccan desert intimately and that I haven't been buried in a dune. I have, but not for the same reasons that Jihan was. And I know Merzouga, and I know Resani, and I know Moulay Ali Sharif, and all the places, and Gurrama, all the places I take you to that are important and holy places in my imagination. But they have become Jihan's, and she has infused them with a meaning that is hers.
Fantastic. I couldn't agree with you more about the power of fiction. I mean, that's mostly what I'm reading, and I think your book accomplishes that in a profound way. So I'm very glad that you chose to fictionalize elements and kind of ride the line between autofiction and novel, and just the result is outstanding. I wanted to go back to a question of timing, because as you mentioned, you had written some of the passages very early on, but you felt that perhaps the climate wasn't quite right for the book, or publishers felt that way, or America felt that way, or there were a number of challenges to basically getting this type of book out there in kind of the wrong moments. I think since then, and you've hinted at this, there have been some bridges that have been built between East and West, and perhaps specifically between nations that have a majority Christian population and nations with majority Islam population. Do you feel that those bridges are stable and sound now, or do we need to have more books like yours in order for us to be able to sort of believe that there can be a lasting connection, or you know, basically a way to get at this division between the cultures, to get people curious about the East if they've grown up in the West?
Okay, so that's a really multi-layered question.
It is. You can just dive in and tell us about the original climate when you tried to write the book, maybe, and then how the climate is
originally
now.
when I wrote the book, or when I wrote the earliest version of the book, I had friends in New York who are very clued into the literary scene who said, Anissa, this is transgressive. There's no way you can publish it in America or even in the English language speaking world, because unfortunately 9/11 had been, the narrative around 9/11 had been circumscribed such that you could only tell the story from the perspective of the victims who were tragically murdered that day, or from the perspective of the terrorists who I don't want to have anything to do with, and I don't want to spend any of my imagination in their lives or in their heads, okay? So, and I felt that if you, so having lived through 9/11, I had a sense that from ground zero emanated circles of experience, and that obviously those in the most inner of circles of that tragedy, that story was the loudest and the strongest, and it absolutely had to be told. And I think that in the 10 years immediately after 9/11, you could not tell any story other than that. And I had to accept that that was just the way it was. But I still believed firmly that some of those other circles of experiences needed to be given a voice. And so beyond what anybody, you know, everyone said to me, you spending 10 years writing the same book, this is ridiculous, give up and write something else. It's not like you don't have something else to write. And I'm like, yeah, and I have written other stuff. I even thought I was like the queen of l'inachevé, of the unfinished. I mean, the number of unfinished works. And I just didn't want this book to end up in the pile of unfinished work. And I felt there would be a time when it might be right to tell this story. And the farther away we are, now we're almost 20 years out from that tragedy. I think the story I tell is recognized as one of a multiplicity of stories that can be told, and that maybe is important insofar as it allows us a dialogue that allows for real healing, a real understanding of the other, and to do what fundamentally my father always taught me to do, having a mother who was French, who had been born and raised in Paris, who had a different experience from my father, and even I, as someone whose imagination constructs itself in English, who spent all my time playing with my sister in English in ways that were inaccessible even sometimes to my mother, nonetheless, we can find a place where we are all the same and fundamentally human. And that's the story I think I've always wanted to tell, using this trauma of 9/11 as a way of saying, let us find the space of our common humanity. So it took forever. It took my actually getting the book translated by originally by someone whom I think she's here, Eleonore Erscovici, is my former student, and seeing me as depressed as I was, she actually translated the prologue into French, or tried, did a first pass at it, which was brilliant, and those who read Sable and the Moroccan version will recognize, should recognize, this is in large part her work. And she taught me that maybe this book could start somewhere else, meaning maybe there was an audience for it in French first. And it turned out, yes, in French, but not in France, in Morocco. And this was a great surprise for me, is that the Moroccans published it first. It got recognized, it got literary awards, and as a result, then it made its way back to what had originally been my readership the readership I had in my head when I was writing it, which was an English-speaking readership.
Right.
That answers part of your question.
It answers part of my question.
Because otherwise, the whole other thing, like, just invite me again and we'll just talk about cultural.
We need an extra hour or two.
Because otherwise we're not getting out of here all time.
That's true. Well, I'm very glad that you opened up and told us a bit about your path to publication, because it does seem like it was a difficult one that took you much longer than you thought it would. The writing and the publishing aspect, and even the translations, are an interesting sort of like subset of journeys within that. But I do want to go back to my big question and ask a very pointed one, which you may or may not appreciate, which is this a political book to you, or is it perceived that way? Let's talk a little bit more about the politics of it.
Okay, I don't know if, I think a couple of the people in this Zoom room were present at my London launch, where the great British novelist Rebecca Lay, who was interviewing me, asked me that question, and I freaked. I freaked because of my fear. Of course, I know that ultimately everything is political in this world, because politics is about power. And anytime you're talking about anything from gender to culture to, the list goes on, where power lies and how it works itself into our world. For me, politics is about far more than governance and government.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nonetheless, I was terrified of this question. And I was terrified of it for the simple reason that I thought, oh my God, he's this first-time novelist. She's Arab American of Muslim origin, and she calls herself a political writer. Label. Okay? And I thought, no one's going to read this book for anything other than that. And especially since I had been told originally through people who I guess I thought they were well-meaning when they were counseling me on how to ensure that the book get to market. People far less wise than my literary agent, Claire Roberts, who is here. Hi, Claire. They told me, take everything that takes place in New York out of the book, take 9/11 out of the book, don't ever mention it, and take Jihan and make her 10 years younger. Okay, so I was still carrying trauma around from, oh no, if you get labeled as a political writer, no one's going to want to read you, or they're going to think you have an agenda, and they're going to assume they know what your agenda is. Okay, but so originally my answer had been no, but okay, but at this, so it's so much more than a political novel, but of course, yes, it is political. That's the short answer.
That's enough for me. Thank you for opening up about it, and I hope that you've come to dread the question less since this experience in London.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Catherine.
Yeah. So I think we've just got time for one or two more, and I might shift the focus a little bit to ask about your second identity as a filmmaker and a film scholar. And, we don't have time to talk about, the body of work that you have in that realm, but I just wondered if you could let us know how producing and studying the art of film impacts your writing, or what effect that has on the way that you approach writing even.
So originally, when I was at Columbia School of the Arts doing an MFA in fiction writing, my sister Yasmina was at Rhode Island School of Design, and she was getting an MFA in photography and film. And I was hitting up against a brick wall where I hadn't come up with this thing about linguistic polyphony, and I was writing stories that were taking place in Morocco in Arabic and in French, and trying to write about them in English. And apparently from my response in workshop, I was failing miserably. I would like to think that I wasn't, that I was simply way ahead of my time. But Yazzie came up to me and said, well, why don't we do video? Why don't we do experimental video? And so the two of us started doing work as a way of finding a kind of liberation from Well, if somebody is speaking in one language, then you just make them speak in that language in the film, as opposed to having to create the simulacra of hearing that language, which you have to do when you write.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I started working with experimental film. And then Yazzie and I enjoyed it so much, we went and got a certificate in film together at NYU. And I even went as far as to write a feature screenplay that was centered around the issue of migration, south-north migration across the Straits of Gibraltar. Another one of my great unfinished works. But what that whole experience taught me was that I actually felt like a novelist more than as a filmmaker or as a screenwriter. But it trained my mind to focus on the image as a means of storytelling. Mm-hmm. And I'm delighted that many people find that reading Dune Song feels like watching a film. That the imagery is such and the pace of it is such that it moves in very cinematic ways. And I find that today, when we consume so much of our storytelling through the medium of film, video, and television, that we come to expect certain codes of storytelling that are dictated by the image. And I think that I like nourishing my fiction with those codes.
Fantastic. Well, it sounds like a happy relationship, actually. This identity within you, that's the filmmaker, the film aficionado, and then the author, the novelist. Wonderful. So I'll invite audience questions now. I think we're just at about that time. If you guys want to just type your questions into the chat box, I'll then read them aloud for Anissa. But I'm going to cheat and ask the first question here. And it's a very, very simple one, so don't worry, you're off the hook now. How do we order your book if we're interested? Is there a preferred way that you have? You know, some people are kind of trying to avoid Amazon right now. So if you have any suggestions for how to get your book, please give them.
So ideally, if you're in the United States, go to the link for my publisher, which is just Interlink Publishing, and order it directly from them, or ask, that you'll get this version, which in the United States is the preferred version to purchase. Okay, and they will send it to you, or you can ask your local bookshop if they have reopened to order it. If you're in Europe and you want to read it in English, you can order it from Sandstone Press, and you can likewise go directly to just type in Sandstone Press and Dune Song, and you'll get the link to my author page, and you'll be able to find a variety of different ways to order it. And then if you want to take a look at the French version, because you've read the English version and you're interested in discovering more about translation and reading the astounding prologue, voilà, you can order it from Les Éditions du Mot Conduit, and you can get it at your local book-shops or at La FNAC. Voilà. I think.
Perfect.
Does that help?
Yeah, no, that's definitely helpful. And we've also got a whole list of questions here, so I'll dive right in. The first one is from Deborah, and she wants to know the topic of the novel that you're working on now. I think you gave us a little hint at the very beginning, but do you want to share more?
Okay, I'll share a little bit because I'm very cagey about this stuff. Yes. But as I mentioned, I'm fascinated with trauma and memory. And right now for my next book, I'm very interested in what the relationship between mothers and daughters and what they transmit to each other in nonverbal ways, and how memory gets transmitted from one generation to the other, traumatic memory, but also celebratory memories, in the sense of, what in God's name am I doing in my great-grandmother's kitchen, cooking up a storm, as if I were cooking for a family of 12.
Where does that come from? Where's the impetus?
You know, where does it come from? Where does my dictatorial stance in the kitchen come from? Where does my tendency to go for this type of food or that type of food come from? I actually think women have ways of transmitting things non-verbally, but even as human beings, I'm fascinated with epigenetics and a host of other things related to that.
Oh, that's wonderful. I can't wait to hear more about that project. The next question is from Sally, and she writes, "Hi, Anissa. I found the alternating chapters meaningful. How did you decide to write your novel this way?"
Hey, Sally. Thanks for the question. So this was, I talked to you guys about alternating fragmented narratives. I knew the story was going to take place in different parts of the world, even when I wanted to tell the New York story, because one of my MFA thesis was called Fragments from a Transparent Page, and it was going back and forth across the Atlantic from Morocco to New York long before 9/11. But this was difficult to do because I originally wrote it in a fragmented way, and it didn't work. The narrative had no drive. It got to the middle of the novel and it had this like soft belly you couldn't get over, and you would just abandon the book. So I uncoupled them. I rewrote the New York passages as a novel, and I wrote the desert passages as a novel, and then I cut them up, and I initially shuffled them like a deck of cards, thinking, how do they fit in? And trying to find interpositions of one chapter against the other that I might not have thought of instinctively. And that was garbledygook. And so then I decided I was actually going to construct it like a musical composition. How do the passages speak to each other? How do they echo each other? And so that juxtaposition was very difficult and took a lot of time, and ultimately ends up being one of the driving forces of the narrative. So that's
fantastic. Great. So the next question is from Sarah. And she says, "I've always thought of women's lives over generations as a kind of migration. It sounds like your new book may have some of these thoughts, question mark."
Absolutely.
That the idea?
Absolutely. In fact, not only do I agree with you that women's lives are a migration, I think that these lives and the movement of these lives ebb and flow like a tide. I have come back to this very space from which I'm speaking to you because the spirit of my great-grandmother brought me back. Because one day I was sitting on a porch in Mystic, Connecticut, and all of a sudden I had this sentiment that she was there. And she died the year I was born. And I don't know why, but I all of a sudden, sitting on that porch, decided I had to go upstairs and find her pearls and wear them. And that became, that's actually part of the inciting incident of my new novel.
That's outstanding. That somebody who you haven't really met, it sounds like, could have such an impact on you sort of spiritually. That's fascinating. I can't wait to hear more.
Yeah.
So Meredith is asking, she's saying, "The sand burial sounds quite moving. How does one get a non-tourist experience like this in Morocco?"
Okay, so this is really funny because I went down to the desert. I had no idea they did this in the Merzouga area. I, of course, am a little bit nuts. I'm in Merzouga in the middle of August at noon, and I hear the story about how locals at sunset go down to the dune, shovel in hand, big, thick blanket on the shoulder, and they go in groups of 2 or 3, and they bury each other in the dune because it's the same experience as like going to the hot springs. It's great for rheumatism. So I go, oh, how marvelous. I want to do this. Except I decide I'm going to do it at 12 noon. And I go, and of course my crazy friends say, great, let's get a bunch of women who are going to do this and help us and bury us all. And so in Merzouga, you can find people who would do this. They generally will not take you at noon on August like 15th, when it's 50 degrees Celsius outside and God knows what it is inside the dune. But so I get buried, and everybody's chatting and they forget me in the dune. And I have this kind of like weird out of body experience. And afterwards I'm quite ill. And that's where the whole idea of, much later, as I'm thinking, what do I have Jihan do? And I go, the dune. Plus there's this other thing. It's in Merzouga, it's a well-known, it's not a myth, it's a story people tell that has to do with Hillary Clinton. So Hillary apparently loves to go to the Moroccan desert. And one time, long before she's running for president, but when she's no longer first lady, she goes down there, and the locals tell her, you see this beautiful dune, it has some healing powers, it's considered sacred by the locals, it has a name, it's called La Alia, and the locals believe if you climb to the top of the dune and you bury an offering, you make a wish, the next day go back up there, you don't find your offering, your wish will be granted. Da-da-da-da. And apparently Hillary did this. And I don't know what she wished for. So I can't tell you if it worked or if it didn't work. But it's in my mind. And so then I'm thinking, oh, what do I do with my sick Jihan? And so I don't want to give away for those who haven't read, but for those who've read, you realize that there comes a time where she has nothing, and the only option is to bury herself in the dune. So what else?
I think I see a little bit of your future here, maybe an interview with Hillary Clinton coming and some sort of publication. I think we'd all be eager for that.
She's a Wellesley grad and a Wellesley alum too. I'm open.
Exactly.
Anybody want to give her a copy of Dune Song? Please do.
We'll see if someone can set that up for us. So I've got a few more questions. We probably won't have time from them all, but Virginia is asking, what pushed you to go into literature and to write a book?
Thank you, Virginia. Virginia is one of my students, and she has talent. So I kind of think I know where this is going. So in this, my grandmother's apartment, you might not be surprised, or maybe you will be surprised to realize when I got here, I was rifling through her stuff because in fact, my grandmother passed away. And when she did, I actually volunteered to, well, don't rent the apartment, I'm moving in. And I found my autobiography, which Anissa at the age of 11 had written. It's full of glitter. The pictures are beautiful, but the ideas are actually really interesting. The stuff I was writing about then, however awkwardly, is still the stuff I'm interested in today. So the answer is, if you profoundly believe that in life, you want to deepen your understanding of your lived experience, the written word allows you that. Then the question becomes, to what extent do you have a deep drive to share that discovery with the rest of the world? And probably if I took so long to publish, because there's part of me that I was actually scared of doing exactly what I'm doing with you guys. I wasn't so sure. If I was la reine de l'inachevé, writing volumes and volumes of things that I never published, I used to joke that I was the most prolific unpublished writer I knew. It's because I wasn't ready to share it, but I knew I wanted to be a writer. And so there becomes the big question, are you a writer if you write every day, but you don't publish? What does publication allow you? Yada, yada, that's another story. So Virginia, to answer your question, the moment I realized that I wanted to be a writer, I majored in political science and anthropology at Wellesley. So Catherine, your story about my being afraid of politics. Okay.
We can fight about that.
Okay. And I was thinking of going to law school, and I worked as a legal assistant in a big time law firm in DC. And I was working on a case in Philadelphia, right on Walnut Street. And I was at a coffee shop writing in my notebook. And all of a sudden I had this realization. This writing is what I want to do for the rest of my life. And I don't want to go back into that courthouse. And I committed then that I would change something about my life. And that change took forever to lead to publication, but it started me on the writing path, where I had been writing a great deal, but that was always marginal and like I was doing it as a dilettante. It was something I was doing as I was waiting for the rest of my life to happen. And I decided I'm going to take this that's on the margins of my life and I'm going to put it at the center, even if the rest of the world doesn't understand me, which of course happened for a very, very long time.
Exactly. And as you say, I think there's a real difference between being ready to write and ready to get into the practice and then being ready to share. Those are completely different things. So thank you for opening up about both. Having a hard time picking between the questions we've got left because we just hit 6 p.m. here, but we can go a couple minutes over. I'll take Kelly's, hers is next in line. So can you tell us more about your workshop experience? How important was that to your development as a writer?
Kelly, is this Kelly from the other side of the Atlantic? If so, thank you for being here.
Kelly with an IE, if that gives you more information.
My Kelly friend. So I got distracted, reminding
So your workshop experience. Community of writers, yeah.
So when I was at Columbia School of the Arts, I hated workshop. I detested it with a passion because I came to the experience not having really solidified my sense of who I am as a writer. And this writer stuff can be a lot of ego stuff. And when you're in a room with 25 other people who have this armor of who they are as a writer or who they want to be as a writer, like this around them, the experience of being in a workshop can be devastating. And for me, what resulted was that I walked into Columbia with a strong independent voice, and I came out of it trying to cater to the least common denominator, having lost my voice totally, which is why my MFA thesis is something that I never published, because I no longer believed in myself as a writer. And what's really, really important is that I rediscovered that in the classroom. I was my fellowship while at Columbia was with Columbia Teachers College, and I was working at the writing project with Lucy Calkins, where writers and teachers were brought together to think about how we teach writing and how we teach language to young kids. We were working in the primary school system in New York. And working particularly in Harlem and the South Bronx with students who, like me, were non-native, many of them, in terms of English wasn't necessarily their mother tongue. I like to say English I took not from my father nor from my mother, but that I crossed the sea to find a home for my words. That was actually a phrase in one of my experimental films. And the kids in the New York public school system gave me a reason for why we bother to tell story and we bother to write. And I rediscovered not only my voice, but I devised what a good workshop could be, which is why I think I'm a pretty good workshop teacher.
I was just going to say, yeah, that brings me to the fact that you've already hosted a workshop actually for the American Library, and that there may be another iteration of that very same workshop coming up soon, we hope. You and I will talk more about that after the event. Absolutely.
And in fact, yes, I'm constantly thinking, what happened in those horrible workshops, and don't let that happen.
Right. A model of what not to do.
That being said, I gotta say, Columbia School of the Arts was going through major trauma at the time and restructuring. And today, from everything that I know, the workshops happen in much more holistic manner.
Right.
Voilà.
Nice optimistic ending there. Well, we're going to have to, that'll be our last question then. Thank you so much, Anissa, for doing this event with us. It was a real pleasure to host you, and I hope that everybody orders their copy of Dune Song or Sable, or whatever language they prefer to read in.
Thank you. I'm extremely touched that so many of you showed up. At one point, there were more than 50 people here. So this is great. I'm sorry that we don't have more time, but you know, we'll have to do a workshop, and I hope many of you will join.
Exactly. And I hope that you guys look out for information about that workshop in our e-newsletter and on our website. I wanted to give a very quick preview too of some of our upcoming Zoom events. So next week on Tuesday, the 2nd of June, we have Mark Mayer, who's a fabulous author, who's going to be giving us sort of a performative lecture, let's say, entitled Distance, Social Distance in the Literary Imagination. So that should be something really on theme and relevant and interesting for you guys. And then we skip a week of programming. We have our annual general meeting, sort of internal business for the American Library, although that is open to the public as well. And on the 16th of June, we have Tracy Brimhall, who's going to read an essay called The Grief Artist, and she's telling us about the role of creativity in grief, both her own and sort of other practices that she's learned about. So I hope that you join us for those events. And this event and those future ones, and our past ones also, will be available on YouTube because we're putting all of our Zoom events there. And also just one last reminder that normally for our in-person events, we invite the audience to donate upon entry to the event. So normally it's about a €10 suggested donation. So if you guys enjoyed what you saw tonight and are inspired to support the American Library, please do use that link that I had sent around in the email with the Zoom instructions. You can just give it a click and donate whatever amount you'd like. So we appreciate your support, and thank you again, Anissa. Thank you all for tuning in, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks. Merci, Catherine, and thank you, everybody. I'm just like marvelous. Merci, merci. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
That was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.